The crisis is with humans, not with the planet. The Earth can take care of itself. It's been in extreme states before, much, much greater extreme states, and it's always resolved it and gone into cyclical climate change, but at a much, much slower rate than the way that we humans are changing it. And the thing that is going to suffer the most is us, the humans.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Beyond the Ice, the podcast from British Antarctic Survey, where we talk about all things polar. I'm Em Newton, and normally on this podcast I'm asking scientists to explain newsworthy climate and ecosystem science. This time we've got something a bit different. It's a discussion about communicating climate science in the media, led by Tom Sheldon from the Science Media Centre. He chats to three scientists from British Antarctic Survey. This was such an interesting discussion to listen to. They talk about what motivated them to start doing more science communication, how they got over imposter syndrome, their opinion on the current state of climate science in the media, whether or not that is online or in mainstream news, and their top tips on engaging anyone in climate science.
You could just go around the table at the start introducing who you are. That would be really helpful.
Okay. I'm Dr. Anna Gilbert. I'm a climate scientist here at the British Antarctic Survey.
I'm Dr. Emma Boland. I'm a climate scientist here at the British Antarctic Survey, and I work using computer models to study the polar oceans.
I'm Jane Francis. I'm director of the British Antarctic Survey.
I'm Tom Sheldon, and I'm a senior manager at the Science Media Centre. But I suppose, what I'd like to find out a bit about is your own research areas, but especially how they cross over into media and what media you've done.
I think it's something that I first got into with seeing how my PhD supervisor did things. So my PhD supervisor was Professor Emily Shuckborough, who's now head of Cambridge Zero at the University of Cambridge. But when I was her PhD student, she worked here at BAST and she did a lot of media interaction, and she was very much like, do you want to come along? And I was like, sure. And then after a while, she was like, well, I can't do this one. Do you want to do it? So I was like, sure. I think my own particular research is quite niche in ocean modelling, and, not that many people outside of the immediate field are that interested in it. But I like the fact that I can go out there and talk about climate science in general to a wide range of people and feel like I'm making a difference. Because I think, most people don't think about climate science, climate change every minute of every day. But I know that we probably all do. Yeah. So it's kind of helping bridge that gap feels really rewarding.
Yeah. One reason that I hear from scientists for turning down an interview or being hesitant or something like that is I'm not the right person for this. And then I tell them the kind of questions that they're going to be asked in the interview, and they say, "Oh yeah, I can answer those." And once they find out that they're kind of A-level sort of level question, if that. And I think too many scientists assume that they'll end up being a bit of a charlatan. They will be talking when they can imagine the other five people who they think should be talking.
You always know enough. I think that's the thing that I've always taken away. You assume you need to know 100% of the detail. Really, you need to know 30%. It's the top line messages that really matter for a news cycle, which is you're going to get a 2-minute interview. Realistically, you're not going to be getting into the weeds of the actual technical measurements or anything of whatever it is. I've given interviews about oceanography, and I'm definitely not an oceanographer, but I knew enough to be able to talk about, trends in sea surface temperatures, for example.
Yeah. And more than 99% of people on the planet, right? And you maybe, people who know more than you, but that doesn't mean you're not qualified.
Yeah, and it's about communicating that important message rather than actually getting stuck into the science behind it.
Yeah. If it's not you, you've also got to think, I think, as a scientist, if I don't do it, then who will do it? And if too many of us say no, then someone else, if you can imagine the kind of person who might want to do it, who you really hate to do this interview, then maybe that's even more kind of impetus that it actually should be you on this occasion. And of course, if enough of you keep saying, if enough of you say yes enough of the time, it shares the burden, right?
I think it's also important to ask who the audience is that you're talking to. You can't start talking about very detailed scientific things. You have to tell stories, and you have to make things understandable. So you can't talk about complex science, and you can't talk about the detail, in too long. So over the years, I've changed the way I describe things. I've changed the stories that I tell to make things a little bit more lively, and really tried to appreciate the level at which I need to speak. And I think that's really important in preparation.
Yeah, I completely agree. You've got to think about who you're talking to and what they want to know as well, because you've got to serve a purpose by being there. And sometimes I think the temptation is how will my peers judge me by what I might be saying in this interview, because they're the people who immediately spring to mind, who will notice if I put a foot wrong.
But that's not who you're talking to,
is it? That's not who you're talking to.
There are people who respond to numbers and facts and figures, which are mainly scientists. And the trouble is, what we're trying to do is to really communicate to the people who aren't the scientists. And I think one of the problems with scientists communicating their science, if they're not careful, is they just add more facts and figures and more numbers. And all that does is compound the problem. And what you have to do is think about how can you respond to those people who want an emotional response. And it's about stories. So I've tried to sort of have a whole raft of stories somewhere in my head that I can refer to when somebody asks about a particular point and tell that story. And I think that gets a much better reception than just learning the numbers.
Yeah, because that's what all news articles are, all stories, aren't they? I mean, journalists are storytellers, and so you have to be adding to that story. But I guess your role as a scientist within that story is to be able to contribute something which is both relevant to the public and interesting to hear, but also doing that thing that you are uniquely positioned to be able to do, which is couch everything in the very best evidence and the expertise that you've amassed over the years. If you could do those two things in parallel, then it's a success.
Yeah. I think it also depends on like what your aim in your communication is, right? For me, it's that climate change affects all of us, no matter whether we think it does or not. And I hate to think that people would be turned off by the fact that it's a scientific problem and I don't understand it. I think because it affects everyone has the right and should have the right to understand it in a way that makes sense to them, so that they can understand or do with that information what they will, whether that's changing things or not. And being in the privileged position of being educated in climate science myself, I see myself as, maybe you could call it a duty, but I also think that I can be that translator between the science and the technical information and, everyone else. And
but there's an element of giving back then.
Sure, exactly. For me, I see it as a way to change things. And that's the most fundamental thing for me. I see this as like the most effective way for me to have a positive impact with climate change.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you talk there about giving people the answers, so you kind of imagine that people, an audience out there with questions, and then you are well placed to answer those questions. I mean, that's how it seems to me that people see science and scientists as the producers of answers in a way that we can trust. And I know that's a massive simplification, and sometimes scientists complain that science is kind of incorrectly viewed as this kind of giant bag of answers that you pluck things from. And of course it isn't that, but also it is, right? I mean, because we don't have any better way of finding the answers to questions that are important in whether it's in the natural world or anything else that affect all of our lives. And the way that you pointed out, Ella, that this is a really important subject. We need to be able to find out the truth about it and separate fact from fiction. I think public look to the scientists for that reason. Do you agree?
They do, don't they? They have the credibility, I think, of the public in many, many cases. I mean, there are some people who don't believe any of the scientists, but I think people do trust scientists, and I do think that they appreciate that scientists spend a long time investigating a problem, and it may not be the answer to everything, but they do have a wealth of knowledge about a particular topic that they may not have. And I would say the same as me believing in somebody who's studied, I don't know, a history of a certain topic or different aspects of life or medicine, and I would trust them if I knew that they had really dedicated their life to studying it well.
I think medicine's a really good comparison, because that's the obvious one where we have a question, which is usually, rooted in some sort of medical anxiety that we need answered, then you go to a professional medic for that answer. And it feels like the whole kind of spectrum of scientific disciplines works to some degree in a similar way, and the public look to the whole profession for that kind of thing. And you gain people's trust and you maintain that trust by being those honest brokers that you've described.
For me, it's the scientific method as a method rather than this homogenous body of scientists, because, each scientist is going to have their own background, their own prejudices, their own influences, but the scientific method is the way that we do things. And that's what people need to understand, or that's the challenge, right? And having trust in, it could be medicine, it could be engineering. I often use the example of, if you're going to deny climate change, then why would you walk over a bridge? If you can implicitly trust that an engineer has done their job without knowing the specific mechanics of how that's going to happen. It's the same with medicine. Yeah. You can trust that your surgeon is going to do a good job without knowing all of the medicine that's gone into their training. Yes. And it's the same. You trust that the scientists or the practitioners of science have used the scientific method appropriately.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And it's something I do if I talk to school kids, I like to bring that in. So I don't only give a bit about the basics of climate science, but also talk about, how do we do science? What is the scientific method? And you can use some examples from climate science to think about cause and effect and how you test hypotheses. And I think that, that fits in really well with your point, Ella, about understanding not just what the science is, but why we know what we know, or how we know what we know, what the scientific method means, right? And that helps engender that trust that you were talking about as well, that the public has in us. And I think if they can understand the principles of the scientific method, as you say, they don't need to know the details.
But at least that you're sticking to it.
Well, exactly. Yeah. If they understand the principles of the scientific method, they can trust that we followed those, and therefore our answers are somewhat trustworthy.
Yeah. I want to go back to the media for a bit, because people have all sorts of views about the media, and they're often quite sort of emotionally charged views. Certainly, I can trace my career to fury at the media getting it wrong, but also, fury at misinformation, bad actors spreading misinformation, whether it's about GM crops or about homeopathy or anything else, and that being sucked up so readily by the media. I want to know as scientists, what your views are of the media, not just whether it's a sort of necessary good or necessary evil, but how do you actually feel about what you see and read?
I generally feel like, on the whole, the media is a really good tool for change. And I think storytelling is a really profound way to make things better and to make things change. And I do still really firmly believe that. And regardless of whether you think the mainstream media has been co-opted by bad actors, for example, or what, I do think that it has this huge mass audience, and that is a very powerful platform, and it would be really silly not to use it. And to see a problem as existential as climate change and to not use a platform as mass as the mainstream media just seems like a hugely missed opportunity. So I do still think of it as a really positive way to influence people. And of course, the media landscape is changing and we have to adapt with it. But I think if we don't adapt with the times and the way that the media is changing, we'll be losing. So we do need to continue to engage with it. And I think if we don't, then we're losing a really key way of changing things.
I like that, seeing it as an opportunity or an opportunity missed. Yeah.
I sometimes feel very frustrated with stuff that's maybe not entirely within the control of the media to change, but maybe somewhat is, which is a feeling that I've also heard from other climate scientists have this feeling that it doesn't feel like the urgency of the problem is coming across, the scale of the problem. And then when I've talked about this with various journalists before, and they say, well, we're stuck with what people will read. We have the data now from websites. We can look at when people stop scrolling. We can look at what people click on. People do not want to read those stories. We can write them, but people won't read them. And so there's this kind of dichotomy, like that we feel like we need more urgency. The media feel like people don't want it. And I think there's probably the media could do more. I mean, the media is not completely apolitical out, and it has its own kind of groupthink and is influenced by its own by bad actors, and also by fashion and by social impacts and by political influences in all sorts of ways. But I think there probably is more they can do, but sometimes it's hard to see exactly what. But it is frustrating not to see how we feel about the climate crisis doesn't feel like it's being reflected in traditional media. But maybe there is something more we could do with new forms of media that could be reflecting of that. But then there's a question of, would people, you come back to the question, are people going to click on it if it makes them feel sad or angry or depressed?
It's the need for the newsworthy hook that's the problem. And unfortunately, because of the pace of climate change, we're getting more newsworthy hooks. So you have more kind of pegs to hang a story on about climate change increasingly, whether it's an extreme event or, ocean sea surface temperatures hitting a record for the full year in a row. And all of those things are happening more and more frequently, which is obviously bad, but it's good for the communication in the format that it currently is.
Because it's tangible things,
exactly.
Measurable or observable things. And I remember from, even just 15 years ago, it seemed to me, at least, there were far fewer of those. I mean, journalists were even saying then, we kind of need the real things on the ground. The decadal, incremental advance of, say, temperature rise is so slow that, it might be quick in geological scales, but it's so slow in terms of news scales, it makes it a difficult subject to report, because news journalists need new things.
But don't you think one of the problems is, I think that a lot of climate change reporting at the moment is sound bites. It's tiny, small pieces, bang, 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 bang. And what we really haven't had is, what I think is missing anyway, is a really good set of, say, TV programs or a series or something about climate change to put it all into context. As if you're out there and you hear one soundbite about
Ella's
climate,
shaking her fists with enthusiasm.
How do you know where this fits into the story?
I agree.
How do you know? And
agree.
what we do, we get Climate, which is dressed up with furry animals, and David Attenborough. They're lovely, lovely programs, and he does his best, but it is dressed up to be acceptable, isn't it? But there's nothing on TV. There's no films. There's nothing that actually sets the context of background of climate change. And it's almost as if people are scared to do that kind of thing.
When I do talks to the public, which is just, here's the basics of climate change and how we know what we know. I often use the ice cores from here, which is really, really great, because people can hold a bit of ice core from perhaps thousands of years ago, and it makes it really tangible. Show them a select few graphs and just explain the greenhouse gas effect very simply using some nice diagrams, and use a few analogies. People at the end, that's the most rewarding talks. People just say, thank you for explaining it to me. It's really clear, and then they also say, now, what can I do? That makes people realize the severity of it, and they can understand it, because it isn't really that complicated. The greenhouse gas effect is something we've understood well for over a century. And you're right, that's what people like to hear. That's what people get something out of. That's how people can understand the scale of the problem.
The stories are missing from television, and I've pitched so many things, been working on this, but it's just commissioners don't want to make programs that people will scroll away from, because nobody wants to finish a long day of work, sit down and watch a program that they think is going to be depressing. So the only way that commissioners will commission a TV show at the moment about climate change is when it's not about climate change. It has to be climate change by stealth, right? So it has to be about something else, and then you can sneak it in. And it's kind of like the way David Attenborough shows do it, is that at the end it's like, oh, and climate change means that the sea ice is disappearing, so these harp seals are losing their habitat and they're all dying. These kinds of kind of tangential ways of getting climate information in. And this is partly a product of the television landscape and the fact that at least commissioners or the channels don't think that people will want to watch this sort of thing. without that kind of element of either hope or the way that I'm trying to think about it, and inspired by Caitlin Norton, is more about courage. Like, if you have the facts and you have all of the knowledge at your disposal, then you can then use this with your eyes wide open to actually make those changes. There is a huge gap for this sort of information that is not depressing, also doesn't push people into doomism, but inspires action, makes people feel invigorated and inspired to do something in the way that you describe, Emma, with people coming back to you and saying, this is a really inspiring talk and what can I do about it? That's the kind of feeling that we want to harness at the end. And a TV program that does that is really missing.
And you can do it factually. So when we give tours of the science that BAS does, one of the places we stop is at the freezer with the ice core, and we look at a graph, and would you ever think about showing a politician, with an arts background, a graph which shows carbon dioxide and temperature over the last 800,000 years, and then the huge kick that shows us where we are in carbon dioxide now? But, you stop and explain it, and every tour that I've taken with a minister, with a politician or a non-scientific member of government, they've taken a photograph of that graph, what was called originally the hockey stick graph, because they understand it and they can absolutely get the point that we are in a completely different world than we were pre-industrial times, and that it shows what we're doing to the environment. And it doesn't necessarily scare them, but it's just information that really puts it into context of climate. I mean, the oceans, the changes that are going on in the ocean, the amount of heat going into it, the amount of carbon going into it, but what's happening as the ice is melting and freshening, and how it affects the whole, the ocean affects the whole planet, not just a bit around Antarctica. That is just quite an exciting story, actually. You could just tell that. And then bring in the context.
I agree. The ocean is the best bit.
Or the rocks.
Or the atmosphere. Come on.
All right. Let me try and provoke you now, because what I've got is a bunch of climate scientists sat around a table saying what the media should be doing is telling our stories much, much more, because we're really important and it's so, so interesting. And I just want to challenge you on that, because it seems to me that climate science and climate change is reported across the media so much. I mean, barely a week goes by, barely a day goes by without some aspect of climate change being discussed. Loads of films and documentaries which do touch upon it, as you say, but I wouldn't call that climate science by stealth. I would say that means that climate change and climate science have kind of inveigled their way into so many kinds of stories that are out there, and it might be dramas, or it might be documentaries, or it might be soap operas, but no one is not talking about this stuff, is great. Right? So aren't you in danger here of kind of over-wishing? Haven't we actually achieved something across the media landscape that was to die for only 10 or 15 years ago?
I'm not sure. I think there's a dangerous trend at the moment where certain politicians are trying to tag climate change and net zero and woke together in a kind of bundle of things that are not to be trusted, things that we don't want, that people don't want, and that anything that has those, if you tag it with the name net zero or climate or woke, is automatically, put in the bin. And I think the reason they're doing that is because it's very effective. So we've got to be very aware of that, I think, as climate scientists. The politicians are becoming a bit more wary of talking about climate science and talking about net zero, because there's certain areas of politics which have decided that it's effective to use those as buzzwords for things that are not good. And it's much more true in the USA, for example, but it's coming here too. And I think we need to be wary of that and not let that become a right-left thing. And I think that's in the UK, that politics has for a long time managed to avoid putting climate in one political side, but there's a danger of that happening. And I think we do need to make sure that it comes across as something that's it doesn't matter which party you support, climate change will happen to you. So I wouldn't say that we are necessarily in the best position we could be for climate change representation in the media. I think there's still much more we could be doing.
Yeah, I think it's about values at the moment. It's much more speaking to values rather than necessarily going back to, that scientific method and making objective statements about what's happening and where we're going. It kind of gets parceled up and used as fodder for whatever side's armory is happening in this battle where you have in the media landscape increasing polarization, and especially you see that online with social media and YouTube, TikTok, all of these kinds of environments. And it doesn't feel like climate change or climate science particularly is getting a fair airing in those sorts of outlets to me. And with respect to the point that we're seeing more climate discussion in the media, well, that's great, but I don't think the urgency is coming across. Like, it's great that the science is there. It's great that we're talking about it, that people are aware of it, but it still seems kind of distant in my reading of most media items, especially when it comes to the news. It's often perceived, or when I talk to people, it often feels like either people think it's not an urgent problem or that it's so far gone that there's no point doing anything about it. And I think those two sides are equally dangerous.
Do you regret that it was ever called global warming in the first place? Because 1 degree, 1.5, 2 degrees, this is not how normal people understand degrees.
I mean, I think global warming was a term that made sense for a long time because for many scientific reasons, temperature rise is one of the easiest things to measure. It's one of the easiest things to model. It's a proxy for a lot of the other things that are going on in the climate system when we add carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And I think it could have just stayed global warming if we'd fixed it. And I think our actions have turned it into a crisis. And I think, I do mostly use climate change, but I think it's quite clear that crisis is more appropriate these days.
I do lots of YouTube communication, and this is a question that comes up almost always in every single video in the comments. Why is it called climate change now? That sounds so benign. And why isn't it called global warming? That was much more descriptive. But I guess the switch from global warming to climate change was to acknowledge that it's not just about overall mean surface temperature rise over a long time. It's about also the things that happen with weather patterns or the ocean or sea ice or ice and glaciers, and to try and capture all of that. But now there's another kind of generation, if you like, to shift towards maybe something that captures the urgency. And you see the words kind of global heating or global boiling in some cases, or climate crisis, these kinds of more emotive terms. And I think, well, for me anyway, I think it depends very much on the audience, what kind of term I would use. Like, typically I would fall back on climate change because it still kind of captures that and is a bit more maybe scientifically appropriate. But in some contexts, the climate crisis feels more like it conveys the urgency of the problem. And that's kind of where I sit. I tend to not use things like climate emergency, but the semantics of all these terms can really vary how we see the problem and how the urgency of the message comes across. And I think at least in my experience of doing news media, I tend to use different language to try and push that message more. Global warming feels very kind of gentle. Climate change feels very sterile. Climate crisis is like maybe not ideal, but at least conveys some of the urgency and the scale of the problem.
Well, on a geological time scale, because I'm a geologist, then the climate has always changed. So climate change to me is just, well, the climate changes. So I actually quite like the term climate warming because we are going into a phase of the Earth's climate which is much warmer than we've known as human beings on this Earth. So for me, we are coming into a new climate state which is caused by warming. So the crisis is with humans, not with the planet. The Earth can take care of itself. It's been in extreme states before, much, much greater extreme states. And it's always resolved it and gone into cyclical climate change, but at a much, much slower rate than the way that we humans are changing it. And the thing that is going to suffer the most is us, the humans, because we are changing our atmosphere and our whole environment so fast that the question is, how are we going to be able to adapt to it? I think we will, but how are we going to look after it and take us back to an environment in which we can live comfortably in future?
Do you want to close with any messages that you want to send to any other climate scientists out there from 3 people who have done probably more than their fair share of media engagement? And by the sounds
it's not
of it,
as bad as you think.
More.
Yeah, it's not as bad as you think. Go out and do it. You know more than enough, and it's really rewarding.
Yeah, and I think about who you're talking to. Think about talking to your grandmother most of the time, or young children, and explain it in simple, not necessarily simple terms, but make sure that people understand what you're talking about, even if you're talking about your own subject. Think about it in advance and try and find the right words.
Yeah, and I think it's about you working to your strengths. And we as a scientific community we have an imperative to, because we are clearly in a crisis. We need to do something about it. Humanity depends on it, if you want to get really grandiose. And it has to happen. We have to change things. And being able to talk to the media is such a powerful tool to make that change happen. And if you can, and you feel able to, and if you are armed with the knowledge that you are, then it's a must.
Another thing I always say, though, is that local politics can also be really powerful. I mean, we need global and national and international solutions, but that's not to say there isn't a role for local politics, because your local council has actually quite a lot of power, and it's much easier for you to influence. You can go talk to your local councillors. It's much easier. You can sway your neighbours to voting differently for local councillors. You can go and tell them what's important to you. You can get involved in something that changes how your city is run, your town is run, your street even. My street became a bee-friendly street, so the council isn't spraying it with pesticides. One little thing, but it brings people together. You're talking about it. That's the other thing I say to people when they say, "What do I do?" Well, number one, vote. Tell your politicians it's important, but also talk to people about it. I mean, we are constantly talking about it, but most people who aren't climate scientists aren't, right? But we do know from surveys that most people are worried about it and do want more to be done about it, but they think other people aren't as worried as them. So talk about it with your friends, talk about it with your family, and don't be judgy and say stop eating that meat, but maybe talk about why you aren't eating meat, for example, if you're not, or why you thought maybe I won't take that flight. Maybe bring it up as a conversation. It doesn't have to be a fight, but it can just be about bringing it into the conversations, because at the end of the day, climate change affects every decision, every part of our lives. So why not say it out loud?
Great. And I think I agree with all of that. And I'd just add, there are some good and bad journalists out there, like there are with every profession, but the majority of the climate and environment journalists across mass media, whichever political flavour of news outlet they happen to be employed by, they get it. They recognise the weight of evidence. They recognise the scale of the problem. They want to report it right. Use all channels of communication if you're minded to, that there are, and there are multiple ones. I mean, you've mentioned talking to giving school talks and that kind of thing. But spare a thought for the mass media. You ignore it at your peril as a community, because contrary to what you might have heard, mainstream media is still enormously influential across all the platforms that we have these days, reaching a big cross-section of the public. They are your audience, aren't they? It's not the climate skeptics whose minds you are trying to change. It's not the mad fringe. It's the 99%. And you still have their ear and you still have their trust. So it's good to hear 3 respected climate scientists who have done some media and are planning to go back for more. Nice to talk to you all.
Great
Thank
to talk
you.
to you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond the Ice. If you enjoyed the podcast, please take the time to tell a friend or leave a review. The next episode of Beyond the Ice is all about the Arctic, and I'll be talking to scientists who've just returned from a summer of science there. We'll be talking about the work they've been doing, why the region is so important, and some of their personal reactions to witnessing this changing region.